thank you to everyone's here and joining us. It's good to see so many friends and folks that we know from across the country and different parts of the industry who have joined us tonight. Good evening. My name is Kevin Griffin. I'm a volunteer and the co-vice president of the BSP National Office. Welcome to tonight's Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Forum hosted by the National Society of Black Sports Professionals and the Cleveland Cavaliers. We're thankful for the nearly 620 participants who have registered for tonight's event. The mission of BSP is to connect, empower, and work to advance its members within the business operations of sports. And the reason why we're here tonight is to equip attendees with D&I best practices and share how those efforts can be operationalized within the sports industry and our organizations. Tonight's event is a collaboration between BSP National, our BSP colleagues with the Cleveland Cavaliers, as well as those with the Atlanta Hawks, Dallas Mavericks, and the Detroit Pistons. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders as we get started tonight. Tonight's event is really designed to inspire connection. So please feel free to use the chat function to connect with folks who you may not have met before. Connect with them, share contact information, and begin to build that rapport. And then also use the Q&A section here. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen to outline the questions that you'll have for our panelists. At the end of each of our sessions, we will have a Q&A session, and that's where we'll find your questions and then surface those for the participants. So thanks again for being here. A couple of other things just before we get started. If you've never connected with BSP, we'd love to have you connect with us and join us, at least starting the conversation. In the chat function, you'll see our email address. It's more towards the top, but you'll see that. And Abby, if you could surface that, that would be great. But our email address is national@blacksportsprofessionals.com. And you can find us on LinkedIn. You'll find us if you just search Black Sports Professionals, you'll find our LinkedIn group there as well. So join us if you've not already connected with us. You'll hear from us soon, and thank you for doing that. Before we dive into the conversation, we thought, since there's so many new people here with us tonight, it's important to share kind of the scope and scale of BSP. So just wanted to make a quick recognition of all the chapters that we have that are active, up and running. We have chapters active up and running in Atlanta, Columbus, Cleveland, Dallas, Houston, Indianapolis, Miami, and Washington, D.C. We have chapters in development in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. And we've had sports business leaders in a number of other cities who have raised their hand and said we'd like to start a chapter in Charlotte, Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, New Orleans, New York, Orlando, Phoenix, Pittsburgh, Portland, and my hometown of Seattle, Washington. So with that, let's get started. We've got about almost 300 people here in the chat who have joined us for the broadcast. So let's get started. We've got two parts of the conversation tonight. The first part of the conversation, we're going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes talking with the Cleveland Cavaliers and their leadership, starting with Nick Bartlett, Kevin Clayton, and Corey James. We're going to talk about what they've been doing with the Cavs to really become the market leaders around diversity and inclusion and the work they're doing to infuse that throughout their entire organization and practice. The second half of the conversation, we'll spend time with leaders from the Atlanta Hawks, the Dallas Mavericks, and the Detroit Pistons, and they'll share with us their insights around the work they're doing in both their community and within their organization around D&I. D&I has been a hot topic since the death of George Floyd. The NBA has been intentional and unapologetic about their stand with Black Lives Matter. So the purpose of tonight's conversation is really to do a couple of things. Number one, give you a behind-the-scenes look at organizations who are really at the forefront of D&I and get that conversation going across different organizations in our industry. And then for those of you who don't necessarily have a D&I program or function within your organizations, tonight, we really want you to connect with some of the leaders that you're going to hear from, be that Kevin and others, so that you can begin to get the step-by-step process on how to set up and operate a D&I program within your organization. This is going to be a candid conversation. We're going to talk a lot about D&I and what that means for professional sports, but also want to make sure that we're getting an understanding of the language and the importance of D&I from the top of an organization. So Nick Bartlett will help us with that, who's the president of business operations for the Cleveland Cavaliers and their suite of organizations. And particularly Nick, who's white, who's going to share with us kind of what the conversation is going along with that. So we thank Nick for his time. So with that, we've set it up. I hope everyone's ready. You got the chat function, you got the Q&A. So let's get started. We're going to welcome Corey James, Nick Bartlett, and Kevin Clayton to the show. Hi, guys.
How we doing, Kev?
Good, good, good.
Kevin, great to connect. Thank you for having me on.
Good to see you. So, Corey, we're going to start with you, and then let's go Corey, Nick, and Kevin. Would you guys just quickly just tell us a little bit about your roles, starting with Corey again, and what you do there with the Cleveland Cavaliers and the family of organizations?
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. Corey James, Director of Diversity, Inclusion, Community Engagement with the Cavaliers. Been with the organization for 13 years. Transitioned into this role April of 2019. Prior to that, spent 5 seasons on our partnership marketing team where I managed a number of those relationships. I started my career in ticket sales in 2007 as an inside sales rep. Spent 5 to 6 years in ticket sales from a premium standpoint, managed suites. And then when LeBron came back, transitioned into corporate partnerships, and then moved on into this role once we formalized the department and Kevin came on board. So together we help lead our organization's efforts as it relates to diversity and inclusion and community engagement.
Great. Thank you, Corey. Nick Bartlett, I help oversee the business operations for the Cavs and Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. And as Kevin said, the brands and partners that come with that. Once again, just really humbled to be on today to talk to everybody. You know, and we can spend more time, I guess, talking about the journey later on. But, you know, I want to tip my cap to Corey because Corey's really been leading these efforts internally until we formalized the team under Kevin's leadership, and has done a heck of a job with some of the other leaders we have within our organization. So we'll talk more about that. But once again, just appreciate everyone making the time. This has been a focus of ours for quite some time, but as obviously as Kevin stated, has been even more crystallized due to the unfortunate events that have happened here over the last 4 or 5 months. And we feel honored to be able to have a platform and to be a part of a league, candidly, that takes a leadership position on things like this. You know, this is something that's incredibly important to us. And we feel like, you know, as a team, we're a community asset, and that asset needs to be about the right things, for the right things, and for everybody. And so we really want to take the opportunity to utilize the platform we have to create sustainable change. And the thing I've been talking a lot about with our group is how do we take moments like this and classically condition our minds to never allow them to come back and to just really work towards positive resolutions as we go forward. So excited to spend some time with everybody, and I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Yep. Thanks, Corey and Nick. My name's Kevin Clayton, and I'm actually in month 15 or 16 or so with the Cavaliers. And from a sports standpoint, I've actually had several stints in professional sports on the apparel side, working with Russell Corporation, Russell Athletic, and also doing this work at the USTA. And I will tell you, for me, coming to the Cavaliers, which I'm from Cleveland, coming back home and to be able to join an organization that had a lot of the groundwork in place. So I could hit the ground running and really just bring some different approaches to how we wanted to take where we were really to the next level. And I'm looking forward to kind of sharing that with you as we talk about how do you operationalize D&I in professional sports with professional teams. But one of the things that I will tell you, it does start with leadership, and then also starts with an organization that is really wanting to do the right thing and to move forward. So Kev, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks all 3 of you for that. Really appreciate that insight. And Corey, we're going to jump in with you and to Nick's point, and I appreciate you all letting me kind of put on the journalist hat. So I'm going to dig deep and ask some tough questions of you all. But Corey, Nick alluded to this, and that was that you've kind of been doing this work already for the Cavs prior to, you know, Nick and or Kevin arriving. So if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing with us, you know, what that work had looked like before it was formalized with the Cavs, and any insights you can share with folks who are on the call today or on their show today who are kind of in that similar situation. How did you keep the smoke going so that the fire ultimately would be lit?
Sure. It's a good question. I think for me, it was a combination of a number of different things. One, it starts with leadership at the organization. You know, one of our big rocks, as we call it, is being civic leaders. And that's something that's continuously been championed by not only our chairman, Dan Gilbert, but also our CEO, Lynn Komorowski. So since I've been with the organization, it's always been important for us to kind of maintain that status within the community. For myself, going back to the kind of leadership and the timing aspect of things, for me, especially over the past kind of 5 to 7 years, we had some significant leaders in place that were able to kind of put in and lay the foundation and offer the opportunity for some of this work to get done. We had a woman of color leading our ticket sales team, same thing with our HR function. So they were able to kind of provide a framework, if you will, to continue to build on. And when I transitioned into corporate partnerships, one of the biggest opportunities that I had was working with some of the partners that had the intention and the goal of doing community work. And a lot of times when some brands define community differently than some NBA teams, and a lot of times our focus was specific based off of, our core values from a youth standpoint, but being able to work with some of those partners who wanted to engage primarily communities of color, mainly, whether it was Nike or Moët Hennessy, that gave me kind of a taste of the work when I didn't even really know that that's what I was doing. But then also I had a leader at the time in Shelly CAMYE, who knew what some of my passion points were, and she gave me the autonomy and in some cases the budget to do some of those things that may not have been in the norm. So for me, one of the things that I realized while I was in that position was that a lot of the things that I was doing was more that was impactful was really based off of the partnership that we had, but also people understand, and especially on this call, that partners come and go. And one of the things that I learned within that space was that I didn't want some of the things that I was doing that I thought was most impactful to be predicated on whether or not we had the partner or not. And so for me, it was how do we put things in place that can be sustained, that are valuable to the organization, that regardless of whether we had partners attached to it or not, were sustainable. And then that kind of brought us to me looking at the next step in my career and knowing that, okay, what's next? Bringing Kevin on, it was a logical next step to be in a position of being way more impactful both internally and externally.
Thank you, Corey. It's interesting, and this is a bit intimate, but how many conversations had you and I had over drinks where you were kind of trying to articulate what you wanted to do, but it wasn't formalized within the organization. So then Nick and Kevin arrived and it was able to kind of formalize that and provide your role. But you constantly, at least I hope you don't mind me sharing, this was always at the top of your mind in your profession.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, for me, especially coming through the ticket sales ranks, when I made the transition into corporate partnerships, I had done pretty well on the ticket sales side, and I knew a lot of people, and people were always still trying to get tickets. But what I started to realize is that I didn't have enough people to pass those leads along to. And at that point, I transitioned out of being excited and always being the person in the room to, why am I always the only one in the room? And then I started to try to figure out what I could do to start impacting that. And I knew that it was going to start with kind of bringing in and cultivating talent and things of that nature. So, yeah, it's always been a priority, which is also why, Black sports professionals is something that is key to continuing that mission as well.
Thanks, Corey. I appreciate that. So, Nick, let's jump into kind of like the practical side of this, not only the emotional side, and you and I spent a lot of time together at Leadership Cleveland learning about some of the things within the city of Cleveland that were some of the ills that everyone's working to improve. But you step into the role as the leader of the business operations for the Cavs as the president, and then you quickly hired Kevin CLAYTON and formalized the role that Corey was leading. Tell us from a business standpoint, and if you were speaking to your colleagues across the NBA or sports, why is this work so darn important, and why have you invested in this from a business standpoint for the Cavaliers?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Kevin. And I think from our perspective, we've always, and Corey hit on this, but civic leadership has always been a kind of a thing that we've always tried to really lead from the front on all facets of everything. But when we looked at this, and Kevin it's kind of a little bit inside joke, but Kevin will tell you it wasn't an immediate process. It took us a little while to find the right one, and it did. We had the job actually posted, I think, a month after I started back with the team, and it was a decision that was made even prior to me coming back, but one that we prioritized as I started to get my bearings straight. Because I think one of the things, and I say this a lot, but one of the things that really stood out to me during Kevin's interview process was this whole value of diversity of thought. And, you know, it was so important from the standpoint of really understanding the actions we're making as a company, whether it's how we market something, how we sell something, how we engage with community partners, but having a holistic view of all the perspectives that may be out there in the marketplace, taking things in. And I would say, you know, to Corey's point earlier, we'd always informally done a really good job of this organizationally. We had never really cracked the code on what this could mean for us from a productivity perspective. And I can bore you with, you know, all the Harvard Business Reviews that we read getting ready for this, and just to understand the true value of it. And now I would just tell you, fast forward to where we are right now, it is an invaluable investment that I wish we would have made, you know, 8 years ago when I was with the franchise the first time, because it gives you such a more well-rounded perspective as you're making decisions. And I almost, you know, some of the things I've thought about is I almost equated to analytics in the sports business. You know, analytics in the sports business 10 years ago was such a new school way of thinking, and now it's a mainstay within the way sports teams operate. And I equate the D&I space very much to that. You know, in a different, weird, transferable way. It's almost like, what do you do without it now? Now that we have the luxury of somebody like Kevin and Corey in their positions, because, and it is, you know, all the unfortunate events aside of the last 3 or 4 months, if those don't happen, it's still even more valuable, in my opinion, because of the holistic perspective that you get. And it allows you to speak to your market and speak to your fans in a way that you never really understood until you have people who have authenticity and who have a passion for what they're doing in this space. And so from that perspective, you know, it's hard to get over that barrier. I'm sure it is for a lot of people, especially right now. I mean, these roles are high in demand, and they're not easy to find people of Kevin and Corey's caliber. But I would just tell you, just stay committed to the journey, you know, because at the end of the day, it's going to pay so many dividends for you in so many different ways. And there's so many, you know, highlights along the journey that we've had even since the last 16 or 18 months. But I would just say it's one of those things. I go back to the analytics example. 10 years ago, you looked at people goofy when they said they were going to hire an analytics team. It's not the same thing anymore in D&I, but it was 2 or 3 years ago when we decided to make the investment. And now it's how do you live without it? You know, it's like I said, it's an invaluable piece of how we operate. And the last thing I'll say is you can't just hire somebody and stick them in a corner. You got to hire somebody, and you got to hire a team, and you got to prioritize the hell out of the efforts and the initiatives. And Kevin knows this, but I've had his back every step of the way in regards to dedicating cross-sectional team members' time to these efforts, making sure that we have practical moments in time where we're just focused on this, because you can't just do it to check the box. You got to do it, and then you got to commit to it both in time and in energy and in practice. And I think those things can ultimately lead to greater impacts. And you know, these guys are even developing revenue models off of it and all these other things that we can speak to later on. I don't want to get too deep into it, but you know, and it's not about the revenue. I want to be very clear. It is about making an impact in the community and what it can do for your brand. This pandemic is a great example of what it can do for your brand and how it can be really impactful to how you make decisions and what you do to navigate these times.
Nick, thanks for that. I'm going to come back to you, and so maybe put a pin in this. I want to play the role of Lynn Komorowski as your boss and say, hey, if I'm providing you your annual review and looking at maybe even your bonus structure for you and your executives, I'd like to learn as we go through this conversation today how the D&I actually fits into that overall assessment of your success. So we'll come back to that if you don't mind, Nick. Thank you for that. So, Kevin, you joined the team, the organization, a little over a year ago, and you really have taken a non-traditional approach to D&I and had a massive impact here in Cleveland and across the NBA. Can you share with us a bit more about your story and how you landed in Cleveland and what you're doing to provide that kind of transformational improvement for the organization?
Yep. So sure, Kev. When you talk about non-traditional, kind of the way that I have approached D&I is that it has to be integrated into the fabric of everything else that the team is doing. And as Corey and Nick were talking about all the things that years prior that we were doing, all I did was put together more of a strategic format, kind of a plan where we could organize our work in a way that every team member in our organization could see how they benefited from the work. So that started from even how we define diversity, how we define inclusion, and making sure that no matter who was in the organization, no matter who our fan base was, that people saw that, wow, this is an inclusive organization. So looking at it from that perspective, we then began to build in very specific metrics, very specific tactics and strategies, just like you would see in any other business plan. And the purpose of doing that is because we didn't want diversity to be on the right-hand side and then the rest of the work of the team was on the left-hand side. It has to be fully integrated. And we have tied the work into every one of our teams being functions, let it be marketing, accounting, HR, operations, or what have you. So the entire organization owns a piece of the success of the work that we're doing. For me, that's been the only way that I know how to do this, because if it's just something that is the right thing to do because it feels good, going back to where we are right now, whether or not this is a moment or a movement, quite honestly, those are just moments. However, for this to be really achievable and sustainable over a period of time, you absolutely have to tie this into the core values and the core work of the team. And what that has allowed us to do is everybody sees how they fit. Everybody sees where their piece of the puzzle can contribute. And it is way beyond just Corey and I for the kind of work that we've been able to achieve. If it was just the two of us, quite honestly, we would not be successful. But I will also go back to the fact that as Nick said, he's had my back, he's had Corey's back, and it takes that kind of leadership from the top of the house to be successful.
Thanks, Kev. Just a reminder for everyone who's joining us tonight, there's at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a QA. Next to participants, you'll see QA, chat, share screen, and then record. Maybe that's only mine, but please drop in your questions in the QA box, not necessarily the chat box. Continue to share stories and resources in the chat, but we'll be surfacing questions from the Q&A section, so please do. So guys, listen, we have about, call it 20 or about 10, 15 more minutes of this section, and then we'll move into the next section. So I want to make sure we leave plenty of room and time for question and answer, but I want to go back to Nick, the question I asked you, and I'd like all three of you to weigh in on how do you measure your success? And I really want to dig in on the issue of, we have a number of folks who are on the call tonight who simply are just trying to get started. They're number one, trying to sell in the idea. They're trying to sell the value. So how do you get started and how do you measure success? And Nick, many of us were involved on sports teams when analytics came in, and that was kind of like a really interesting, it was a battle, quite frankly, for folks to understand what it meant and then the value to the organization. So maybe just crystallize that for us and give us some context. Give us some elevator pitch.
Yeah, no, I would say first, and you know, and I've talked to Kevin a lot about this, but first is you do have to define it. You know, you like what I learned through all this is diversity and inclusion. It's not something that you think you know what it is, right? You really have to define it, and you've got to lay a foundational layer of knowledge first and foremost across the entire organization. It can't just be at the senior leadership level, because a lot of that stuff doesn't always permeate down or doesn't always trickle down. You'd like to think that it does. And I think the other thing you have to do, and we mentioned this before, but once you define it and you create kind of a baseline, then it's really about engagement with all aspects of the organization. And Kevin and Corey lead a group on our team called the Ideal Committee, which is really, said differently, it's like a culture committee. And Kevin and I talked a lot about this when he first got started. I was like, look, I really want to do a culture committee. He's like, well, let me work on that after we lay this foundational knowledge piece down. So I think you have to start by level setting, and then you have to take that and you have to build tactics off of it. And I think one of those tactics I talked about is a DL committee. We call them TMRGs, team member resource groups, within different verticals of the organization, whether that's, you know, by gender, by race, by sexual orientation, whatever that might be, but create those TMRGs to be able to, or ERGs as a lot of other people call them, to be able to really gain a pulse of what's going on. And then now, like, when we go to even make decisions about culture or direction, one of the first things I do is go to Kevin and say, hey, what do you think the ideal team would say about this? What would they do there? And so I'm fast forwarding a bit, and it's a bit of a bridge just based on the time that we have, but it's all about laying a foundational level of knowledge. And then it's about creating tactics off of that allow you to penetrate every aspect of the organization, because without having that, you really don't understand where people sit. You don't understand what's going on. And then you have to be willing to invest. We just put all of our team members through training that a good friend of Kevin's. I will tell you, from a senior leadership perspective all the way through to an entry-level team member, they have said to a person, that was the best training that I ever went through. And it really creates, once again, and Kevin can talk more about it because it's really, he deserves all the credit for it, him and Corey do. But those are the things I think you have to do. And you have to create a continuum of what the expectation is. So you start with the foundation, you set goals, but off of those goals, you've got to understand that it's a journey. It's going to take a while to turn an aircraft carrier, as we like to say. And so I think that's really ultimately what you have to do. And then to build off of your other question about bonuses and finances and compensation, look, I never envisioned this, Kevin. I'm not going to lie to you, Kevin Griffin. But it has become more and more clear to me that ultimately we know what drives behavior. Compensation drives behavior in a lot of levels within organizations. Culture gets you a good part of their way there. But we've started having exploratory conversations around what that can look like in our organization. And we remain committed to it. It's a little tough right now, given everything that's going on in the sports world with the pandemic and COVID and all those things. But we're committed to finding that solution to be able to, once again, like I said, classically condition people's minds to make sure that this isn't just a fad, but this is really, or as Kevin likes to say, this isn't a moment, it's a movement. And that's something that we remain committed to doing and figuring out here over the course of time.
Nick, thank you for that. And I know you and I have had hard conversations about this with our Leadership Cleveland class. So let me ask you this. What were the challenges for you as a white male who didn't necessarily grow up in an African-American type of environment? So as a leader, and you and Lynn and Dan are white males, what were the challenges for you as a white male to understand this issue?
Yeah, look, I'll go back to our response to George Floyd right after it happened. Look, I grew up in Minneapolis. Where everything took place was 2 blocks from where my little sister lived at the time. And so it hit really close to home for me. And I would just say, Kevin there's moments in time where I won't say it was a light bulb because the light bulb's been on for a long time. My parents did a great job of raising us to be very equal-minded. And I can give you a ton of examples growing up as a kid of what my dad used to do to help show us that. But I think all that being said, we hosted a town hall with all of our Black team members a couple of days right after the George Floyd thing happened. And I felt shameful. I felt embarrassed. I felt hurt, candidly, that I hadn't done more. I hadn't thought about more through the whole process. But just listening to our team members when they would leave a game night and they take their wallet out and their license out and their insurance ID card out and they put it in the visor of their car. I will never forget this for the rest of my life. And listening to how it's almost unanimous across the board. From the standpoint of if they get pulled over late at night, they're fearful of what could happen to them. That'll be something that's seared in my mind and has really even further seared the fact that we have to be a part of something bigger than ourselves in regards to this. And so for me, there's been certain moments in time like that have kind of crystallized those things because I never really looked at it like a black and white thing. I look at it like a humanity thing. And now you realize it is a black and white thing. There's no doubt about it. And Kev, you know this from Leadership Cleveland, learning about the GI Bill and redlining and all the things that have gone on systemically within our society, they're just so wrong. And you'd like to think that, I even think about the prison system in the 90s and what happened during all those things. So I've made it it's a passion of mine to research it and to understand it, and to never look back and to always just feel like, how can you make change? But I go back to that town hall, man. It was so impactful to me, hearing what our team members have had to go through. And these are upstanding, incredible individuals that live a great life and do great things. And we got to be there to support them. We got to have their back. And we got to use our platform. And this is why I'm so proud to work for a guy like Adam Silver in the NBA. We got to use our platform to educate people on these things. And, it's been really disappointing to me to have conversations after the NBA has been out as progressive as they've been with some people around, why are they doing this? And I kind of look at them, I'm like, what do you mean, why are they doing this? This is about what's right. And once you break it all down, it's ignorance at the end of the day. And the lack of education that leads people into these situations. So, I couldn't be more proud to be in a league and a part of a team like with Kevin and Corey that are leading these efforts. But, it's a big thing and we can't look back. We just got to keep going forward and keep making progress.
Thank you, Nick. If you guys don't mind, I'll just share one quick observation. Being here in the Cleveland business community and working with a lot of top-level CEOs and CMOs and others, for the group on the call, the Cleveland Cavaliers have transcended being a sports organization. The conversations we have about the Cleveland Cavaliers is that they're a great community asset, and we think about them as a business, not and a community, again, a community asset, not as a sports organization, which I think is all credit to the great work that Nick and Lynn and everyone, Kevin and Corey, are doing. Folks, continue to please drop in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom. We have a lot of questions. I have a few more questions to tee up, but I think your questions are better than mine. So we're going to go straight to some of those questions, if you don't mind, Kevin and Corey and Nick. Really thoughtful questions. I want to start with one from Sarita Carter in Seattle, Washington with the Seattle Seahawks. Kevin, she asked, what was the training that was so magical that Nick referenced, and how did they get a hold of this person?
Right. So I actually dropped my email in the chat, and the training, the first part of the training really had to do with us getting to know each other, us building trust, and also beginning to explore different dimensions of diversity beyond just race and gender so we could all come together. And we began to introduce the whole term about cognitive diversity, which Nick talked about from the way that we think and thinking styles. So it wasn't the traditional kind of D&I work or training. It really was more, was more expansive to cover how do we come together as an organization? How do we get to know each other? Because getting to know each other, building trust with each other will lead to us being able to have real conversations and bring our whole selves to work. But as I said, I've dropped my information in the chat, and anybody who wants to know more about it, I can give you the outline and share with you also the vendor and our partner that we use.
Another great question, is D&I HR?
No.
Can you guys expand on that? I happen to know your points of view, but please expand. What we continue to hear is D&I HR work, and they're one and the same.
You know, look, I would say this. Alberta Lee, who leads our HR team, also happens to be Black as well. Between her and Corey and a few others, they were kind of the informal leaders of these efforts for quite a while until Kevin got here. But I would tell you that it is absolutely not necessarily a function of human resources. Don't get me wrong. There is a high degree of overlap, and there's a partnership that Kevin and Alberta and Corey have forged through this that's been fantastic for us. But that's just one component of it. You know, the component, at least from my perspective, and Kevin, please feel free to cut me off here, is there's a whole nother ability when you think about what you need to do from an engagement end to really, truly be out there, be organic, be authentic within the community, that you can't just leave it within HR. There's a whole body of work that goes associated with it. And we've even, you know, and Kevin and Corey have done a great job with this, but it's even influenced our theme nights from a marketing perspective. It's influenced how we sell things. It's influenced how we communicate to our fans. And so it's not, if it's just, I feel like, and I'm passionate about this one, if it just lives in HR, it doesn't create the impact that you want it to have within your business, because it's got to be a wider lens. You got to look at it across the entire entity of all the verticals that go into how you operate a company. And that's when you really start to see great change and great impact.
Thank you, Nick. Another great question, folks, and continue, everyone here on the call, continue to please drop in questions on the Q&A section that's near the participants at the bottom here. Corey and Kevin, how did you get other departments to buy into the vision and philosophy and build rapport across the organization with the goals and objectives of your D&I work?
Go ahead, Corey.
I think it took time. I think that, you know, we've been in this for 16 months, and to Kevin's and Nick's point earlier, we spent the first part of the year just educating. And I think that was the main thing that we had to start with was when you make the transition and people don't know what it is, start to have the conversation. And then with the things that have transpired over the year, especially starting with George Floyd, that's when a lot of the aha moments and the light bulbs went off, because they started to see and they were thankful that we had been having conversations and established kind of structure over a year and change earlier, to where we weren't necessarily reacting just kind of transitioning in the moment based off of what was happening. So I think for us, it was about having, continued conversations and continuing to provide opportunities for learning and education. And that was the beginning.
Yeah, and to add to that, as Corey talked about the first 6, 7, 8 months of us really educating and learning, the other thing that he and I did, we spent probably the first 3 months gathering information and data. And the purpose of that was, if you treat this like a business plan and treat it as part of the business, there's not any initiative that is ever going to survive, or any program or any strategy, if you don't have the data that supports what you're doing. So we did focus groups, we did interviews, we sat in on different team meetings, and people saw that, wait a minute, they're not telling us what to do, they're listening. Then we built a plan out of that had the feedback from our team members, including leadership, all the way down to individual contributors, our part-timer staff, everybody, so that when people could see themselves in the plan, and the plan, to Nick's point, wasn't just around the HR component, that's a huge part of it, but it connected to the business, to the markets, it connected to supplier diversity, it connected to culture. So there's not a part of our plan that doesn't touch everybody in our organization. And when people saw themselves and felt included in the plan, that's when we were able to energize them to want to be a part of it.
The other thing that we were able to do as well, I'll just add on, is that during the season, we also was very strategic about how we leveraged certain games and promo nights to really show the power of the relationship that we had created, and how it's more holistic and it touches every aspect of the business. So I think being able to use kind of this past season as a lot of different learning opportunities was huge as well.
Corey, I really appreciate you saying that. I got two last questions that they're going to be somewhat hard hitting. One is for me and others, but D&I does not necessarily mean black. You guys do great work around LGBTQ nights, everybody. I mean, so maybe you could kind of expand on that. That you guys do a lot of work with all groups and all groups who may be disenfranchised or underrepresented?
Well, I can start there, and one of the areas of focus within our kind of ideal platform, or aspirations as we call them, is community engagement, and the whole premise behind it is that we need to be relevant and trusted within all communities, and all means all. So for us, we had to take specific approaches to engage each one of our target communities on varying different levels, also knowing that different communities need different things. And so what we did is we developed those relationships so that then when the games rolled around, we were just using that as a platform to either bring that group together and talk about what we had already discussed, or use it as a platform to launch things that are more ongoing and forthcoming in the future. So I think that's one of the things that we've always tried to do, is remain relevant and trusted in all communities, and understanding that there's so many different dimensions of diversity. In order to be relevant, you have to tap into all of them.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Folks, I can't keep up with all the questions, and we've got a few more minutes before we turn it over to Nicole and others for the second part of the conversation. So please feel free to reach out to Kevin and Corey. They dropped their email addresses into the chat. You'll see that there, and you've got some great questions, so please follow them directly. I'm sure they'll take the time to answer them. Last question from me, and then we'll turn this over. And thank you for your time, everyone. As a classically trained marketing exec, let me ask the tough question for Nick and Kevin and Corey, if you want to chime in as well. What were you trying to solve for, right? You're putting these investments of time and money and resources and putting your brand on the line. What does D&I actually solve for your organization?
Okay,
So
so
you want me to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first? I'll pick it up.
It's a great question, Kev. I mean, look, I think from our perspective, it solves for many things. One, it does give us, like I said earlier, I've said this a few times, but it gives us just a more well-rounded perspective as we're making decisions. So often in times, you sit around a room and you're making decisions to try to guide the organization, and it allows you to balance the equilibrium quite a bit. And I think that is huge too. As you've seen this emphasis on diversity and inclusion grow, I can't stress the importance enough of the I piece of it, which is the inclusion piece of it. I think diversity, there's no doubt there's incredible value there, but diversity without inclusion, as Kevin has taught me over the last 16 or 18 months, diversity without inclusion you go nowhere. And so I think that part has been incredibly important. And then what's really opened my eyes too, also to just the amount of opportunities that are out there to truly impact the business, to truly impact revenue opportunities, whether it's working with existing partners or creating new platforms for brands to be able to engage. I can't tell you, when we were going through all the stuff as the season was canceled and we were part of the bubble in Orlando, I bet you damn near 95% of the partnership conversations we had were focused on how can we be a part of your D&I efforts. And so, like all the other stuff I talked about earlier, invaluable, right? You can't put a dollar price on any of those things qualitatively, but quantitatively, when you're sitting across the table from a partner or sitting across a Zoom call from a partner having a conversation, and you can provide an in-house turnkey solution for them that allows them to grow and amplify their own diversity and inclusion efforts, it's huge. And then you start thinking about the exponential impact that has, not just to your bottom line, but within the community and within the region. It's like it gives you kind of chills. And whether it's Cleveland Clinic or whether it's an insurance company or what, it doesn't matter who it is in our portfolio of companies. Quicken Loans, which is they have a huge D&I effort as well. It really, you have to have it to believe it. I believe that. Like a lot of people, it's like you got to kind of invest and then you see if it works out. This is something, once you invest, I'm telling you, it immediately works out, because you can have very concentrated, educated conversations with people, and you can just see their eyes just kind of go, I never thought of it that way. I never looked at it from that perspective. And so it's been a huge opportunity for us, once again, both qualitatively, but really it's going to equate to a lot of quantitative benefit for us in the long run, because so many of our partners are looking to us now to help them build the platform, which we can then obviously in return monetize and be able to take back out to market. And I can't understate this enough, it creates a ripple impact within the community that you don't even really understand, because of how many different eyeballs and things in people's lives that it touches.
Well, Nick, you didn't leave me much to pick up now. I'm just gonna
It's usually the other way around, bro. It's usually the other way around.
So let me just add this. And unfortunately, I've been in the game long enough when there was no inclusion with diversity. Heck, I remember affirmative action, then diversity, then we added inclusion, and now it's this term equity. You haven't heard us talk about that one time. And the reason why is that if we get the diversity piece correct, if we get the inclusion piece correct, then that's going to drive all the systems that are not equal for people to progress in the organization. And equity is going to come as a natural outcome of giving the first two. So you can add all the names and words, and now we've added belonging and all this other stuff. If you don't get the basics, D&I correct, the rest is just add-on. So for us, the value proposition is that diversity and inclusion is going to equal equity. And that is going to help us from a systemic standpoint, making sure that we do have equity across the organization.
Thank you, Kevin.
Hey, Kevin, before
you have something to add to that? I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, going back to what Nick said and what Kevin said, when a lot of people right now are thinking about diversity and not inclusion. And so I think that a lot of people right now are trying to hurry up and put people in place, and they're worried about representation. But in reality, if we're not creating cultures for those people that we're seeking to bring in right now to where they feel comfortable and they want to stay and recruit others, then we're only doing half the job. So I just wanted to add that as we transition as well.
Thanks, Corey. I appreciate that. I'm working with a group that we all know here in Cleveland, and they actually have an I&D practice and not D&I for that very reason of what you articulated. And as they position the employee value proposition that we get a chance to work with them on, this is what the conversation's all around. So really great point. And it's, as we go into these conversations with open minds, it certainly does help us all grow. I want to thank all of you on behalf of BSP, Black Sports Professionals, for allowing me to be here and share the conversation with Nick Bartlett, my friend, president of the business operations for Cleveland Cavaliers, my mentor, Kevin CLAYTON, my dear friend, Corey James from the Cavaliers. Thank you all for your time today. Great conversation. If you want to connect with them, please connect with them over in the chat section. Share your email address. They've got a lot of information that they can share with you. And as we stated to kick off this call today, the entire point is to provide you resources within your organization to build your D&I practice within your organization. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the co-vice president of BSP National, NICOLE BRITENRIKER, who is with Learfield's IMG, and a very dear friend who will take us from here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Good evening, everybody. I imagine I am not alone in thinking that was absolutely amazing content that we just heard from the Cleveland Cavaliers, and one of the most robust and successful D&I teams in sports in general, not just the NBA. So I have to thank the Cavs, Kevin and Corey, once again for one, your time, and two, your transparency. And to everybody that I'm not acquainted with, I'm NICOLE BRITENRIKER, and I'm fortunate to serve on the leadership teams for both the National Black Sports Professionals National Office Board, also BSP North Texas here in Dallas. So I encourage all of you attending today to engage with our organization, starting with joining our national LinkedIn page, and continue to seek out BSP in your local markets as we are flourishing and growing significantly. However, we are now transitioning to a second portion of our programming, which is even more amazing content from the DE&I. And after hearing the Cavs story, we're in an additional treat, here for an additional treat with the journey of 3 other NBA teams. And I'm going to invite Kevin Clayton of the Cavs to join me to help me lead this conversation with some of his peers.
Hey, NICOLE, thank you. And I get to switch hats now. The first housekeeping thing that I will say is from a question and answer standpoint, there's actually some questions that are there that may be applicable to our next 3 guests as well. And if not, we'll make sure that we capture those questions. And my commitment is that we'll get answers and send them back out to people who were actually signed up. So we have an amazing trio of leaders, and I'll just kind of start with my dear friend, Gail O'Bannon, who is the Vice President of D&I for the Mavs. And Gail, you got into the role through a non-traditional career track, and you heard Corey kind of talk about how he got in the role through sales, and I know that's part of your background. Can you tell us how you became the D&I leader for the Dallas Mavericks?
Thank you so much for having us and creating this space for us to be able to have this conversation this afternoon. I do want to shout out to my Mavs family. I know they're on here somewhere, so I need to say hello to them and to my daughter for supporting. But thank you for the question. So my name is Gail O'Bannon. I am the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion with the Dallas Mavericks. I kind of like Corey, I started in ticket sales. I was a temporary account executive for 90 days, was hired on full time as an account executive, and was in that role for probably a couple of years. And then I spent 8 years as the first group sales manager. And then I transitioned into director of group sales. I was there for about a couple of years. And then when St. Marshall came in a couple of years ago, when our culture was going through a transformation, I was offered the position to be the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. Took some time to think about that, but I have been with the Mavericks for 17 seasons. I spent 15 in ticket sales. And I would say that being in this role, pretty much like Corey, I was already doing some of the work. So there's just a passion, I think, in me of D&I and what diversity means and just being inclusive of people. So whether it was through, seriously, as a chili cook-off or $1 billion sell-a-thon, or in our department having, summer burger, and just different ways to be able to connect our organization and to move collectively together. That was just something that I was just doing on my own. So it went for me, as Nick was talking about, the fabric and the woven fabric was me having a needle and thread to getting a sewing machine. So that's kind of how you look at it, but it is definitely the fabric of our organization, and I'm happy to be here, and that's my intro.
Oh, thank you, Gail. So next we have ERIKA from the Detroit Pistons, and I want to thank you for joining us. And I'm just going back to maybe the first time I met you, which was the Pistons were playing the Cavs, and you happened to be in town, and you were telling me all these great things that you were doing that sounded like D&I work, but yet when I read your title, VP of Community and Social Responsibility, the D, the E, the I, none of those are in your job description. So can you kind of connect the dots for your title, but yet you are doing the work as well? And thank you, Erika, for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being able to speak on what the Pistons are doing in this space. And you're right, I don't have D and I in my title, but I do have responsibility. And the Pistons have a responsibility not only to our employees, but also to the community in which we play to give back in this space. So my whole career has been in community and social responsibility. I started with the Detroit Pistons and the Detroit Shock. From there, I went to Chicago with the Chicago Sky. I'm originally from Chicago. From there, I went to the Golden State Warriors and then back to the Pistons. And I've been back with the Pistons for about 4.5 years now. And like many of you guys have said, it starts with leadership from the top down. And this is we don't have a D&I role, but our company is very passionate about this work. And in my role, I lead a lot of the programming. So I'm able to work directly with the community and the needs of the community to be a bridge between the Pistons and what's kind of going on. So that's kind of how I fit into that D&I space and role.
So Erika, thank you. And also, can you please pronounce your last name for the audience? Because I got a feeling I jacked it up.
SWILLEY, Erika SWILLEY.
Yes, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Nope.
Okay, so our last panelist is CAMYE MACKEY, Executive Vice President, Chief People and Diversity Officer for the Hawks. And CAMYE, I saved you for last, but for all rights, you should have been first. And I say that because the Hawks were the first sports team to hire a VP of Diversity and Inclusion, and my good friend Nzinga Shaw. Now the D&I, though, was added to your responsibilities, and you also kind of heard Nick's perspective of where HR and D&I connect. How are you able to do what you do from these two positions that are so important in the organization? Tell us your story.
Sure. First, I'd like to thank you for having me here and for BSP for continuing this very, very important conversation. So again, I'm very humbled, and it was just enlightening to hear the other speakers ahead of me. You bring up a really good point. When I look at my history, I'm not from sports. I did not grow up in sports. I've been with the Atlanta Hawks for 2 years. But my background is primarily from working with global organizations in the entertainment and hospitality industry. And in those particular industries and with these particular organizations, there was a huge focus around creating great experiences for the employees, for the fans, guests, customers, as well as for the business overall. So when I look at my particular role as the Chief of HR and the Chief of Diversity and Inclusion, it really is two separate entities that have parallels that really enhance one another. So a big part of what I do is focus on the culture. Just making sure that we have a culture where everyone can show up and everyone feels that they have a place and that they can thrive and that they can grow. The other big piece is on leadership, and this has come up a couple of times. Having strong leaders, looking at who we're hiring in the first place and bringing into the organization, people who come with a mindset, a set of values, beliefs that align with what we believe in, makes it a lot easier when you're doing the D&I work and HR and marketing and sales and everything else that we do as an organization. So me kind of leading both entities, it really is something that from a D&I standpoint, from the HR work, D&I goes beyond that. And that was said earlier today. You're involved in the community. You're involved in a lot of the social justice initiatives that we have here as an organization. We're involved in metrics. So there's a lot of things from that standpoint. But I'm very excited, and that is what basically I do from my role is looking at both elements and complementing them along the way.
Thank you, ladies, for that background and insight on your roles and how we got here today and where you are. I want to shift our conversation and start with BSP North Texas's own, a valued member and one of our favorite supporters in the Mavericks. As we see your work here working tremendously in the Dallas community, the Mavs' own Gail O'Bannon. And Gail, I want to get your insight. You have a unique position by being the only Black female, or only female essentially, with a professional sports team with a Black woman CEO. When did the Mavs journey begin? How have you and Cint been able to operationalize your work?
Well, thank you for that question. And it started about 2.5 years ago when Cint became the CEO of the Dallas Mavericks. And she came with a very specific vision. And that vision was just around diversity, period. So coming into the organization, it wasn't about, selling more tickets and what we were doing in the community. It was really focused internally as it relates to diversity, where we had a executive leadership team that was all white, and coming in and looking at our supplier and diversity, just all of it. And so with her, she helped me to say, okay, we need to sit down and have strategy. And she had a 100-day plan. That plan was very visible for our entire staff to see, which included the D&I strategy, which focused around our customers and our reputation, agenda for women, our family, which included our work family, our home, and our community, our talent pipeline and what we have going there, and then also supply diversity along with our sponsors. So it was very intentional that she wanted to come in and be able to set the standard for the NBA. We started with our employee resource groups, and the first one that we launched was our women's. We have a Black employee resource group, we have a parents at work group, and we also have a G35, which is our employees under the age of 30 or have less than 5 years of service. We created business planning and very intentional about what our goals were and being able to share those goals with our staff, along with a new set of values, which is being able to perfect our crafts, which is around character, respect, authenticity, fairness, teamwork, and safety. And when it comes to safety, we include both physical and emotional safety. So as you can see, it is about the culture, and it does start from the top down, but I also think it's the bottom up. Even though it was me, just in July, I ended up having a new person on my team, Mackenzie Watson. I'm excited to have her, but it's really everybody plays a role. It's everyone's responsibility. It's not something that you can write on a whiteboard. It's not something that you can talk about through training. Everybody has to own it. And so she came in and we had a vision, we were able to see it, and we worked through it. And it's just been a process for us. Our staff has been very open. They've been very engaged. And we started that 2 years ago. And so as we move forward with COVID and George Floyd, we were already truly set. She had us where we are, our mind is where we are, and then we just kind of execute that plan. So she's been phenomenal. And, if you know Cint Marshall, then she's unapologetically Black. And for the Black women on this call, you can wear your natural hair to work. You don't have to worry about that part either. So that's really important, because that was something that we couldn't do before at the Mavs. It was always question of what you do and have your braids and have your locks. And I know that sounds very trivial to some, but it's really huge, because that really affects your culture. People, when they cannot bring their authentic self to work. So I like to work in real life case scenarios so that our employees know we're human, right? And this is what we're doing. And then we can take that out from internally and be out in the community and do the work that we really need to do in our community.
That's an amazing insight. And I know I personally have heard down the street all the great things happening with the Mavs. I consistently tip my hat and also find myself very jealous of the inclusive and or that you have helped lead the charge with in creating. And honestly, it wasn't just us locally who have noticed. I mean, the NBA commissioner named you guys the blueprint, right, for teams across the league. So kudos to your work there.
ERIKA, you know, there's no D&I team. However, you've been very successful. And with that, just, you know, share with us, and you began to talk about it a little bit, what are some of the challenges that you face without having a diversity team?
I would say we don't have a ton of challenges. I would love to have a dedicated D&I person to keep us accountable on a different level than what I'm able to do from my seat. It definitely, like I said, comes from our ownership and our vice chairman. They're very supportive. We've been able to take a holistic approach as an organization. So we do have a D&I task force. We have someone from every single department that sits on that task force that's able to weigh in. We are talking to community members. So we had a community conversation where we spoke to key community stakeholders. We spoke to the Detroit Police Department. We spoke to the youth to kind of see what are the challenges happening in Detroit. How can the Pistons kind of be a bridge to help with that? I always say that as a basketball team, that's what we are, a basketball team. So we don't always have the answers. So it's important for us as an organization to align ourselves with those that are doing the work, figure out how we can give our time, our resources, and our money to back that and support that. And one thing that we've done too is we have had a Black town hall similar to you guys, but we have made it a monthly thing. Our vice chairman gets on, he's able to hear directly from the Black employees, kind of some of their grievances and what are going on. And we have made adjustments after hearing directly from those people. One nice thing about our organization too is that I know a lot of times basketball operations and business side are very separate. Where we operate as one kind of cohesive unit. So when we have these calls, we have our head coach on these calls, we have our GM on these calls. Everybody's kind of weighing in from all different parts of the business. We have first-year salespeople that are weighing in. And then we're able to take that back to our task force, talk about that. People are able to talk about what's happening in their departments. And from there, we're able to create real change within our organization. And I think that was kind of our first step, was making sure that our house was right before we started doing things in the community to help other people. I would say in the last couple of months, we have done a deep dive within our organization and have made a lot of changes. We've made a lot of changes on our leadership level. We have made different hires. We have created a pipeline to make sure that we have diverse and inclusive hiring. And then we've made sure that everybody is buying in. We've had multiple trainings. And we are dedicated and committed to this work, which I think is important. But until we get a dedicated D&I person, I think the approach that we're taking in terms of getting everyone in the company involved and everyone feels like they have a voice has been very beneficial to us. We also have a link website where people in our staff can email ideas. So if you don't feel like talking to someone, you can email, hey, have we looked at this? I'm having an issue here. And we can kind of address that. But everyone in our organization is on board, from our ownership down to our salespeople and our basketball operations side as well.
I'm afraid to imagine what you are going to be able to do when you do get a dedicated person. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm going to go to CAMYE for just some thoughts about Atlanta. CAMYE, I remember when the D&I role was created and the Hawks did some amazing things. I remember because I was living in Atlanta then. And you created a community advisory board. You involved local historically black colleges. You added a barbershop in what was then called Phillips Arena. You had you brought in Atlanta hip hop community. You had the civil rights culture. So you had a solid foundation. Let me just shift for a moment. How were you able to build on that foundation after the George Floyd murder and the subsequent protests? How did you leverage that to go from where you were to really dealing with that disaster?
And I think that's a key point, having a foundation in place. So we were able to align very, very quickly. Started with our senior leadership, started with our owner, our CEO, 2 white men coming together with other Black leaders within the organization. We spent time. I mean, when it took place, when that happened, we got together and we met a couple of weeks, every week, just talking, sharing stories, the impact, listening to our team members and things that were actually going on, and having conversations. What we knew was important before we jumped into additional actions was to have the conversations, to talk, and to let people share what they were feeling, what they were going through, and to learn through that experience. By doing that, we went back to our guiding principles. So our guiding principles were already in place, where we are inclusive, where we collaborate. We come with a team approach. So we levered those in this particular time of crisis. The other thing we did was we really went deep with our foundational pieces. And when I look at the foundational pieces, we kind of have them in 3 buckets. One was looking at our workplace. And that again is the culture. We had the conversations, courageous conversations, roundtables. Again, we picked up on our internal brand and made sure that we were true to who we said we were, looking internal. It's kind of that look in the mirror first. How are we welcoming people? How are we involving people in the organization? How are we celebrating individuals and developing people? So a lot of those practices, we went really deep in to make sure that those were there. When you looked at the workforce, again, we took another deep dive, because before we can go out and say what else we need to do, we did a check to see, are we buttoned up? We were in the midst of our performance management process, and that's where you do your annual reviews. We had calibrations, but one of the things that we did add to our process were talent reviews. And that's where and this goes back to equity. This is where every single person within the organization, all of our full-time team members, we will look and assess and go through and say, hey, who is ready to be promoted? Who needs to be developed? And if someone isn't, we're asking the questions, why not? What are we putting in place for John, who's been here for 5-6 seasons? He's an African-American man. He hasn't been promoted, but Joe has. So we're starting to have those tough conversations from a talent standpoint to grow and develop, our team members from that standpoint. Then you go into the marketplace, and that's where we have done traditionally a lot of great work. And I give great kudos to our previous Chief Diversity Officer, Nzinga Shaw, building the pipelines of individuals that we could tap into, building the community programs that we can partner and align with during this time. But I would say in doing so, a lot of our partners going into being inclusive, we're truly partners of influence, people who had resources, authority to make decisions that we could activate very, very quickly. One of the key initiatives that we were able to do out of the gate was to turn our arena into a voting precinct. And the way we were able to do that so quickly was having some key, and I use the word and call it what it is, having some of our white leaders of influence at the table. When we're talking about these different ideas, who can pick up the phone and call their connection, down with the government to say, hey, we want to make this a precinct. What do we need to do? We had our owner to talk about the foundation, to bring finances in place so that we could do that. So I think going back to your point, Kevin, is having a strong foundation in place helps us to lever and to evoke change in ways that might be a little bit more nimble. And we're looking at very impactful ways that we can now be a part of the solution in our organization, but also in the community from a broader standpoint.
Yeah. CAMYE, thank you. Thank you.
I would love to hear also ERIKA and Gail's perspective. And I think there are a few pinnacle things that both organizations have done post George Floyd and the social justice awakening across the country. So can either of you take a second or two just to touch on specific things that you leveraged in your already capacities when this incident happened?
Absolutely. You know, I love what Cammie said. I think the Mavs are doing some of the same work. We met with our Black employees and gave them the safe space to be able to express their feelings. We met with our staff and was very open and had those conversations. We had a courageous conversation with our community and had the 6 systemic, racism and oppression. We had those different systems there in place, someone representing each one of those systems. That led us into our Mavs Take Action plan. And I'll just read it because we actually have 2 individuals who we have hired on to lead this effort for us. But we pledged to listen, learn, and unite our DFW community to address racial inequalities and disparities, and to promote social justice and drive sustainable change. We are committing $5 million investment and 10,000 employee volunteer hours over the next 3 years. And we started that really day one. And so we've been working through that process. Internally, we've been having conversations, experiences of understanding. We've brought in some guest speakers, Jane Elliott and Dr. Eddie Glaude, and had those conversations with our staff, and we'll have one more coming up in the next few weeks. We also are going to have small group conversations where we have small groups, and we'll continue those conversations. We have implemented some training and expanding on our inclusion journey. And we're right now we're in the thick of voter registration. Very important, sure, to everybody out there to be able to use your voice and vote. So that is so important. And for us in our workplace promise is just every voice matters and everybody belongs. And we're going to take that internally and externally and make our voice count coming up here in these elections, which is very important.
So, yeah, we're doing similar work, similar to the Hawks. We do not own our own arena. So we are turning our practice facility. We used it for the primary election this past like 2 weeks ago, August 17th or something. And we are doing it again in November. Using our practice facility. We have also committed our employees to volunteer as well. So they volunteered to work the polls, which there is a shortage of this year. So I encourage everybody, if you are able to seek that opportunity in your city. We are doing a lot around the census. Detroit stands to lose millions. We were the city with the lowest census return 10 years ago. So we are making sure that we are not in that same boat this year. So we're doing a lot around that. We have brought in guest speakers as well. We have started a book club. We have done hiring training with all of our managers. We are continuing to do training with our staff. And we are committed to, figuring out and learning exactly what the Detroit community needs. So like I said, that we can put our time, resources, and money behind those organizations. And just continuing to listen and learn to our employees to see exactly how we can be impactful. So we're doing a lot, but we're also, trying to take it slow so that we get it right as well.
Nicole, I'm gonna jump into some of the Q&A because there's 55 questions in there, and the first question that I've pulled out is one that I get asked a lot, Cammie, and that is, can a non-person of color, and actually the question is, can a white person lead the diversity work in an organization? For Cammie?
Sure. Can they? They can. But I think it's really important that the experience, and this goes back to being inclusive, the experiences that a person has to be able to connect, relate, share stories, and, you know, and help to be impactful from a different way. So I would never sit here and say, no, a white person could not, because I don't know that person's background. That person could have grown up in an environment where their experiences could have a different look and feel.
Yeah. So thank you. And I will just add on to that. And then Nicole, I'll ask you to pick that up, because the reality is that until you know any person's background, and that includes us as Black people, because we're not all raised the same. And there are some friends of mine that are in this work that quite honestly grew up without the Black experience. They grew up very differently. So I really love what you said around, you have to know the person's background to have the cultural competency to do the work. Thank you.
Yeah, I would, next question towards ERIKA, and it's specifically related to your leadership and ownership, and wondering if there's an alignment between their personal ideology and diversity and inclusion. And if there was an alignment, how do you think efforts of yours would be impacted?
Yeah, there's definitely alignment. Our vice chairman especially is very vocal in this space. So you kind of know his political views, to know or tell him is to know. And so he is very passionate about this work, and we will continue to look at partnerships that we have, that if they are not aligning with the work that we are doing, then we are okay with, you know, making those tough decisions, because we have to be able to go out with our values and missions and align them with other organizations. And if they don't, then unfortunately, the Pistons are okay with taking a hard stance with not working with some of these groups. We've also gotten backlash from season ticket holders. And again, we are holding our ground in terms of, you know, then this is what the Pistons stand for. And if we lose a few fans along the way, we're okay with that. We don't necessarily want those people in our building. So to know that we have that support from our ownership and our vice chairman is huge when we're trying to go out with different initiatives, and just knowing that we have that type of support.
Yeah, which isn't surprising, right? I think a lot of us outside in, we see how the leadership and the views, and especially in the most recent past few months, have traditionally clashed, and or the shifts that have come to be and changed based on former ideologies and leadership that was there. And that transcends NBA, right? Into other leagues and other organizations as well. My next question, and ATL is mentioned in here, so CAMYE, if you want to take this, feel free. Do you think it's easier to be successful in D&I in a higher minority population like Atlanta, or harder because there are higher expectations to engage the community?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think it goes back to what you're looking at when you say diversity and inclusion. Inclusion, I like to highlight on that piece, looking at not the differences. So in Atlanta, you have quite a few Black people there. So there's no shortage. If you have a position, pretty much, you probably won't have a hard time finding any, you know, Black African Americans for it. But when you're looking at skills, when you're looking at something specific, you still have to make sure you're bringing in the most qualified and the best person, you know, from that standpoint. So I think, you know, there is a high bar, because you do still have to go through those same expectations and deliverables, regardless of it being a community predominantly Black. So yes, to find candidates to do things, yes, there's a great pool. You still have to go through the same dynamics, because I strongly feel, you know, if you bring people in, you know, from a hiring standpoint, just because of their color and they're not the most qualified, that does you a dissatisfaction as well.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And as someone who works in talent acquisition on the hiring side in my organization, you know, there are barriers at all different levels that we have to transcend to really make DE&I the fabric of your organization. So it's not just bringing them in the door. Gail, would love to know your perspective on what we can do as organizations in any capacity to develop and progress our employees of color and underrepresented areas in the sports industry.
Ooh, that's a great question. And I may lean on CAMYE for this one with her HR background, but you know, I think I heard it the other day on a call. We have to start infusing the pipeline, and we have to be very intentional about who is in our pipeline. And it's going to take some time to move through. I know the NBA is going to make some efforts and have a training program that's coming out, but I think that's going to be the biggest piece, and that's going to start with your HR department. It's going to start with the higher ups to understand the makeup and be realistic about what the makeup of your team is and what your talent is. And it's gonna. I've just seen it over the years, and I just think that you're going to have to be intentional, and it may take a little bit more time to go through and vet through those applicants. But I think you have to do it, and you have to also do it internally too for the individuals who are in ticket sales and creating that career path for them and laying it out so that they know exactly what they need to do to be able to continue to move forward and upward in the organization.
And Gail, I jump on that. You're so right on point. We can't miss out on looking at our internal talent. And, you know, they may not have the exact skills needed right now, but we can work to develop them to get them where they need to be. But that is an intentional practice. And then the other thing, you know, when people say, oh, I can't find minorities, you know, for this particular job, I'm an example of someone who wasn't in sports. Sometimes to become diverse, we do have to look for a skill set, but we may have to look in a different industry for that particular skill set. And I think that's an education as well, that you don't, certain roles you need a sports background, but in all roles you don't, but there's skill sets that you're looking for.
We're gonna begin to wrap up. We got a couple minutes left, and I would like to ask each one of our panelists if you can give us 10, 15, 20 seconds of a final thought that you would like to leave with the still 250 plus participants who've joined in. A final thought, and you know, ERIKA, let's start with you.
I would just say, if you don't have a D&I person, or if you see holes in your organization, don't be scared to speak up. I know I wrote a candid email to our senior leadership, you know, asking them to do a deep dive into our organization and look back. And my thought was one of two things. One, they're not going to respond the way that I want. And then, okay, I know where we stand, right? Or two, something's going to happen or change is going to be made. And I got a response right away saying, you make some very valid points. Like, let's sit down and evaluate and look at this, you know? So like I said, don't be afraid to stand up and push back. I think we have to police each other in our organizations. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's the work of everybody. Don't just look at, you know, your VPs and your HR. It's the work of everybody in the organization.
Thank you, ERIKA. CAMYE, if you could take 10 or 15 seconds.
Sure. I mean, this is an amazing time we're in right now. I mean, it is an amazing time. So I just encourage each and every one of us, no matter what our role is, no matter what we're doing, to use our voice, to use our platform, to use our influence, to use our skills, or whatever it is to help make a change right now.
Okay, thank you. Gail?
Oh my God, I love what CAMYE just said. I would just say be very intentional about D&I, because it unifies the whole community. And what we do here, yes, we're in sports and entertainment, but what we're doing in-house is just bigger than basketball, because it really can affect change, sustainable change in our community.
Thank you, Gail. And Nicole, please, final thought from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, after taking all this in from these ladies, I'm like, all the things, I just want to regurgitate it, but I would go with leverage, leading, and essentially you can do that from where you're at, and don't shrink yourself despite the role of responsibility you have.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, there are a few words that I heard that I just wanted to just share. Throughout the conversation, I heard leadership. I heard having a strong foundation. I heard that you have to have ownership's involvement as well, connect the work to the business. We also heard that it's about culture. We also heard that you have to have courage. And those are just some of the cornerstones of what makes D&I actually sustainable in professional sports teams. The other thing that I'd ask you to think about is the fact that we had multiple people speaking from so many different angles. And there's not one D&I job that is the same. What Gail does with the exact same title as I is very different. And the other thing that I would want to share with you is that we all are colleagues. We all share. We share best practices. And some of us have heard kind of about the crab in the barrel syndrome, where one person's trying to get ahead of the other. Yeah, when any one of us succeed, all of us succeed, and we are each other's cheerleaders. So I would encourage you to encourage each other. I love what I saw in the chat, and you all are just exchanging information, because that's how we're going to move the ball forward. So I'd like to thank Nick Barlage, who was joining us. I'd like to thank Corey James. I'd also like to thank Kevin Griffin. Nicole, thank you. Gail, thank you. CAMYE, ERIKA, and Abby, I know you're behind the scenes and you were working very hard to make all of this happen. This does not happen without us coming together to really make this more than just a moment. So the movement you see in the NBA starts obviously with our commissioner, but it goes all the way down across our organization. So on behalf of the Cleveland Cavaliers and our Time to Talk series, we thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.